Welcome to the Cover 2 podcast here from Athlon Sports. My name is Braden Gall, and at Braden Gall on the internet, I guess.
And I'm Stephen Lassen. I'm also at Athlon Stephen on the internet, on Twitter, or whatever the X thing is you want to call it, or Stephen LCFB over on Facebook and Instagram. And by the way, athlonsports.com. We've got a bunch of college football content every week. Please check us out there.
And you can watch the show on YouTube, Athlon Sports YouTube page. You can go watch the show. So if you've always wondered, as many of you, of course, have, what the two of us look like while discussing college football, you can go watch us on the Athlon Sports YouTube page. Go check it out.
The helmet wall is looking good, I think, this week.
People are clamoring.
So if you want to donate a helmet, at Athlon Stephen, donations to the Stephen Lassen Helmet Foundation always accepted.
In honor of this week's events in the country, do you have to donate like equal sides of the game? Like if you have like a Michigan helmet, if you get an Indiana helmet, do you also have to have a Michigan helmet to like award both sides equal time?
That is a very good question. So I try to put as many matchups as I can on the board here. As you know, sometimes I have like 80 something of them, so I'm not quite able. So most of the time I try to just focus on like the top matchups, but if the team is playing a big game, I will put that one on the wall as well. But I would love to have all 136. And yes, I'm looking at you, Delaware and Missouri State next year. So
Well, soon there'll be a new division. It'll be only like 60 helmets, so you'll be okay.
What am I going to do with all these then?
You'll have a different podcast about a different show, a different sport. You're gonna need a different host to do that one. The All G5 podcast with Stephen Lassen. No, lots of stuff to get to today. Obviously, some big games in the SEC coming up this weekend with Georgia and Ole Miss and Alabama and LSU. We've got some G5 stuff. I've got Washington State questions, Stephen. Washington State questions. A huge weekend of upsets with teams in every conference losing, but in particular, the most unpredictable and our favorite, number one in your minds and number one in your hearts, the Big 12. We will discuss all of the different things. And, of course, sort of what are the implications in the playoff? We are recording this on Tuesday afternoon at around 2 o'clock Central Standard God's time. So if you are listening before the rankings come out, which hopefully a few of you are, we are not going to talk about the rankings at all this week. There's a lot going on. We're going to have a better schedule for you guys set up next week. But honestly, I was asked a few different questions by people. Stephen, I don't know about you. Like, hey, what do you think? I do radio interviews like you do, right? And people were like, well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that element? And, what does this mean for the scenarios for BYU? I was on in Kansas City and somebody was asking me that. And I was just like, guys, win your games. And if you win most of your games, if not all of your games, you're probably going to get into the tournament. BYU, Iowa State, Colorado, maybe. I don't know. There's Ole Miss could still win their way in to the tournament. So I don't know. There's just so much going on. Like, I still think the same rules apply, which is the rankings don't really matter all that much. It will be maybe interesting to learn how they value one team versus the other. But at the end of the day, win your games. Don't worry about all the different. If we lose in the Big 12 championship game and Indiana has one loss and then the SEC champion has two losses, like, do you think we can get it? It's like, just win your games. Just win your games. If you're BYU, just win your games.
What is it that I always say at this time of the year? It's all going to work itself out. There are 4 weeks of regular season games plus the conference championships. In other words, just take a second and think. 5 weeks of games. Think back 5 weeks ago and think about what happened. Did anybody see Alabama losing to Vanderbilt at the start of the season? No. I didn't see many people pick Texas Tech last week. So what I'm getting at is there's a lot of losses still to come, and you just have to take care of business each week, keep stacking victories, and some of this is just going to play out. There's elimination games in the SEC. Looking at the Big 12 schedules coming up, I think there are going to be some upsets potentially down the road in November. So long way to go. I think the best thing that when I look at the playoff rankings or any top 25, it's a data collection moment for me. I'm trying to just understand what the committee values in terms of wins, 1 versus 2 losses. Long way to go. Take a deep breath. Don't let it get your blood pressure up. That's my best advice.
And you say 5 weeks ago, like 5 days ago, we had a totally different playoff bracket potentially. Right. So we'll get to all of the big upsets: Clemson, Texas A&M, Kansas State, Iowa State, Pittsburgh, et cetera, et cetera. What does that mean for the conference championship races in each of those leagues as well? And then some big stuff in the SEC coming up. Penn State, Ohio State's where I want to start. And I just so it's a couple days removed now. Obviously, on Tuesday we're recording that. I didn't think it was the same Penn State Ohio State game for most of the game. It didn't feel that way. It felt like the gap had closed a little bit. It felt like Penn State had in fact closed the gap. That basically they've only overcome one time, right? With the 2 blocked field goals, not a sustainable model to beat Ohio State routinely. But it felt like the game was pretty evenly matched. I did not think that Ohio State was clearly the better team like we do think about this matchup many times. That's a positive. That's a big step for Penn State. And I think for most of that game, I felt like I was watching 2 teams that on any given game could win any game in the playoff. Any game in the playoff. By the end of it, on the last 2 possessions, I felt like we were right back where we started with Penn State and Ohio State, with the head coach of the Penn State Nittany Lions not necessarily managing the end of the game correctly. I don't love questioning play calling, but it was an interesting set of plays on around the goal line. I don't really care that an offensive lineman went in motion. I think people are like way too caught up on that. Like, if it was good plays, it was good plays. I don't love the way the fourth play worked out, and certainly Ohio State leaned on him on the final possession. But I came away afterward thinking, I think either of these 2 teams can still absolutely win any game. But I don't know if either of these 2 teams can win 4 games in the playoff. That was a lot I just threw at you. What do you think?
Yeah. I think I trust Ohio State to go further in the playoff. I think some of the flaws that I had worries about with Penn State showed up in that game. If you look, they completed 13 passes, and 6 went to Singleton, 4 went to Warren, and 3 went to receivers. What I'm getting at is the biggest flaw for this team still is the lack of difference makers at receiver. And
does Ohio State have any of those?
They got about like 4 or 5 like dudes who can play. I think they could start for a lot of Big Ten teams. But I think the one thing I was interested to see is, outside of the playmakers for Penn State, the offensive line for Ohio State, with the shuffling they did, Donovan Jackson kicking over to tackle from guard, and they ran for 176 yards. That may not seem like a lot, but I think at the end of the game, where they were backed up on the goal line, and to your point, I'm a big believer in Andy Koltanecki, but the play calling sucked at the end of the game. I think maybe you give the ball to Tyler Warren one more time and see if you can punch it in. Putting that aside, when Ohio State needed to get that yardage at the end of the game, they just basically pushed around Penn State's defense with a rebuilt offensive line. So we saw it struggle against Nebraska. 1 week later, they did just enough in a very difficult environment to get the win. So a lot of credit to winning at the line of scrimmage, and also in this game, it's like difference makers matter. I think Penn State, the thing to think about like ahead, they should be favored in their next couple games. So to your point, hosting a playoff game, very viable, and I think they'll probably be favored over whoever they're playing in that game. So I think they can win a game or 2. I just think outside of getting some difference makers, I mean, there's no trade deadline in college football. It'd be nice if they could acquire one. I just don't see them being able to go like beyond maybe the semifinals or beyond. They just don't have those difference makers at receiver.
I will say that Penn State road trip to Minnesota looking a little bit more sneaky than we thought. Look, what do we always when Mike Leach passed away, RIP, I talked to a lot of coaches and I said, what is the next evolution of the air raid system to get to the best system that we're in now? Because almost everybody claims, and rightly so, that Mike Leach is like almost every layer of football, high school, college, pro, can kind of be the modern elements of offenses can be traced back to Mike Leach's air raid. But the next evolution of the air raid is the one that includes some more running game, some more power football. That's Chip Kelly. That's Koltanecki. That's all these guys that we've talked about over the years, whether it's Lincoln Riley or, whatever, Cliff Kingsbury, on and on and on down, Lane Kiffin, Josh Heupel, whatever it is, down the line. And the real key is being able to run the football when you have to run the football. Not just, hey, to line up and run the ball on first down because that's what, we all believe when we grew up. It is cold weather, bad weather, short yardage situations, or with a lead in the fourth quarter. And ultimately, we can talk about how the offense for Penn State hasn't really scored any touchdowns in like multiple games against Ohio State's defense. We can talk about the difference makers. That's fine. But if they could run the football when they had to, they could have won the game. And they didn't. And Ohio State, with a revamped offensive line, absolutely did the thing they had to do, which is run the football when they had to. Not only that, but they did it for 4 straight four straight set of downs. So I think ultimately that was sort of like, look, I think I came away from the game going, these are both really good teams. They could both absolutely win a game in the playoff or multiple games in the playoff. They can beat almost anybody in college football if they play well, and the gap has closed. And then at the end of the game, I said, there's Penn State again. James Franklin and Penn State not managing the last 5 or 6 minutes well, even though they put themselves in a situation to win, not able to push Ohio State around when they had to. And Ohio State answered. Give them credit. Will Howard was phenomenal on that last drive. The blocking was phenomenal on that last drive. So give them a lot of credit. And what it does, I'm curious what you think of the Big Ten race now, because Indiana will go, they'll host Michigan in one of the biggest football games in Bloomington history, which is phenomenal this weekend. Still undefeated now that Curtis Rourke is back. After they did trail. They did fall behind 10-0 and then proceeded to drop almost a 50 burger on Michigan State on the road. But they'll host Michigan this week. Then they get a bye. Then they go to Ohio State 2 weeks from then. But Penn State had the loss, and is that good for Indiana? Oregon, of course, dominated easily against Michigan on the road. It was like 28-10 at halftime, and then they allowed Michigan to have an idea of a comeback, and then it wasn't really a comeback. So what do you make of the Big Ten race with the loss to Penn State? Penn State now with the loss, Indiana, and Oregon, as we all predicted, the last two undefeated teams in the conference.
One thing on the Penn State-Ohio State game was, I have to admit, when I saw Zion Tracy pick off a terrible pass by Will Howard in the first quarter, I thought, oh, Penn State might do it.
Right.
They were up and Happy Valley was rocking. And I thought, man, it's going to be different this time. And to your point, Ohio State kind of made the clutch plays. And also, I think being able to run the ball is critical in the red zone too. We see a lot of these offenses move the ball between the 20s. They cannot get the ball in the end zone because they can't run it. And so I think on the Big Ten race, I think that game, Ohio State, Indiana, is basically an elimination game at this point. I don't see Ohio State losing. I frankly don't see Indiana losing to Michigan or Purdue at this point. I guess anything can happen in a rivalry game, but it's hard to see Purdue or Michigan. And as crazy as, to look at the spreads and see Indiana favored by double digits over Michigan is just insanity this year. But Ohio State gets Purdue at Northwestern, Indiana, Michigan. They're going to be favored in all those games. So I suspect Ohio State and Indiana, that's an elimination game. I think Oregon's going to run the table. So Ohio State, Indiana, November 23rd, de facto Big Ten championship game play-in. I think as far as Indiana's playoff hopes, I think the bad is the strength of schedule is not very good. The good news is they have dominated. And I think that will help them a lot because they're going to be competing. If the schedule breaks like we're talking about, they're a one-loss team that has dominated all season against some 2 and probably 3-loss teams that aren't getting in but are sort of on the bubble. So I think they're okay as far as playoff hopes if they take care of business against Michigan and Purdue but lose to Ohio State.
I think if they play well against Ohio State, to your point, if you're going to compare Indiana at the end of the year in the playoff conversation to other teams with quote-unquote weak schedules, right? Whether that's Iowa State, let's say, could be in that conversation. Pittsburgh could be in that conversation. Missouri could be in that conversation. A number of teams. You have to put Indiana at the top of the list because of how dominant they have been. I think, so if you're going to talk about a team getting in based on strength, hey, they got the benefit of the doubt on their strength of schedule, which is it is what it is. We can't do anything about that.
But you can control how you play.
Yeah, they're total dominant. I absolutely think it's okay. I don't, people say margin of victory shouldn't count because you don't want to run up the scores. And I get what you're saying there. Oh, game control. Remember we had a whole year where we made fun of people for using the phrase game control.
Body clocks too.
But if you are dominant against people every single Saturday, that should be a factor that we think about. It is not, we are not robots. We can look at a team that is totally dominant against an inferior schedule and say, look how great this team has been. And that you are not the contents of your resume and, whatever. So I think they are ahead of all of those teams. Any team that could be in the conversation with a bad SOS, I think Indiana has to go to the top of that list. The question is going to be a 10-2 Alabama, with one of the top 5 schedules in the country. That's the other side of the spectrum, right? A team that has a worse record, but has played far more difficult schedule, has better wins, et cetera, et cetera. So, but we kind of knew that about Indiana once they got to 4-0 and 5-0 and 6-0 and 7-0 and now 9-0. It's the same story.
Well, to your point on the Ohio State game for Indiana, a close loss could really do them a lot of favors if they play well. If they get blown out, that's a bad. It's obviously a bad thing. I do think there's room for both here. Just sort of thinking, kind of down the road here. Alabama would have a win over Georgia. Obviously, they have the loss to Tennessee. If they beat LSU, it's another top, 15 type 20 victory. Just looking at the bubble, I mean, we're kind of getting into that discussion of 2-loss teams. I don't think a 3-loss team is going to get in, but I think if 11-1 Indiana should feel pretty secure. And then you start talking about some of those 2-loss SEC teams. It seems like there's going to be room for both at this point.
Clemson gets destroyed at home in almost every phase of the game by Louisville. They make it close at the end. Texas A&M, same kind of deal. Basically destroyed in almost every facet of the game. Could not stop the run against South Carolina and could not stop the pass rush. South Carolina, really impressive showing in that one. A very bizarre, totally, I don't know, unique is sort of the word to use with the Houston Kansas State game with the weather and the delay and absolutely no rhythm. And Kansas State with a 2-score lead in the fourth quarter. To give that up is bizarre. Iowa State played a prototypical Iowa State football game and just didn't get the stop on the final drive. Illinois' loss to Minnesota kind of counts in this conversation. Pittsburgh loses to SMU, also totally dominant for SMU. The winner in all of that upset stuff that we're talking about, to me, is the 10-2 at-large bid. That is the winner in all of this. The 10-2 at-large bid, because I know I've been saying it. I don't know if you haven't disagreed, but you're not really agree. I think there's going to be 6 10-2 2-loss teams. There's going to be a bunch of them because some teams are going to lose in conference championship games and get in. Some teams are going to be 10-2 in the regular season and get in. There might even be a 3-loss team that loses in its conference championship game that shouldn't really be judged based on that because they have to play an extra game, and they could get into the tournament. So I think we're going to have a lot of teams with some losses that get into the tournament. And frankly, if you are trying to get in as a 2-loss team, you needed Saturday to happen. And that was one, and there's probably going to be a couple more.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, if you're Ole Miss, you now have a clear path to get in. You got to beat Georgia. You beat Georgia, you handle your last couple of games, which is Mississippi State and Florida. Ole Miss has a very clear path to get in, and it's exclusively now about a win over Georgia at home this weekend.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's the interesting thing about the 12-team playoff. And then also as the calendar gets deeper into the season, we're starting to understand the path of some of these teams. Like for an Ole Miss team, it is win out and you are in. But that also, to your point on the 2-loss teams, I was just doing some quick math. I mean, I think probably those teams 7 through 11 are probably all going to be 2-loss teams. That's the cut line for me. 3 losses, maybe some chaos. I could see somebody with 3 losses being in the discussion. I just think it's going to be a significant lift. You're going to require everybody to lose the next couple weeks. So I think if you want to be an at-large team, it's 10-2. Maybe the exception 9-3 is if you lost to 2, 5, and 7 and we're competitive. But it's Ole Miss is the team that I keep coming back to because I think Ole Miss is going to rank very high in the metrics at the end of the year. But if they're sitting there with 3 losses and one of those is to Kentucky, it's going to be really hard to make a case for them.
LSU, though. LSU is an interesting one. Your loss is on the road to A&M on the road and against USC, although that's a bad loss now, I guess. Yeah. LSU is an interesting one. I don't really again, I've sort of always overlooked LSU because they probably should have lost to South Carolina. I don't think Missouri's in this conversation because their strength of schedule is bad. They don't have any good wins. They're not good, quote unquote good losses, but they were really, really ugly. It's funny. I was watching the Tennessee game with my daughters, and what's funny is as all the other stuff is happening, I'm watching Tennessee probably play a B- game against Kentucky. It's a rivalry. Kentucky always kind of gets up for them most of the time. Clearly got up for them in this game, and Tennessee sort of they played with their food a little bit in the second half, and I'm they didn't look particularly great tonight, but because of everything else that happened, they have a better playoff resume, which is so weird to do because you're nothing. Tennessee's not any better at football because Pittsburgh and Clemson and Kansas State and Texas A&M and Iowa State all lost. What was interesting though is I want to ask you about Washington State because technically a team that got a little boost in its strength of schedule because of all that chaos was Washington State because Texas Tech is the team that got the win over Iowa State. That actually helps Washington State. Might be their best win of the year. Washington goes on the road and beats USC. And Washington is a win that Washington State has. Break down Washington State's chances here. If they finish 11-1, they will finish with Utah State, New Mexico, at Oregon State. So Pac-12 on Pac-12 crime, and then Wyoming to finish the year. It's very possible Washington State is 11-1. What type of resume are they looking at that point?
I think it's tough to see a path for Washington State. Now, if you want to make a case for them, their one loss is to a very good Boise State team. They have, like you said, wins over Texas Tech. They have a win over Washington. Those are really quality victories.
Yep.
When I look at like ESPN's Football Power Index and whatever you think of the rankings, they're in the 40s by that. So it's just hard for me to see them. There's no win that can move them, like move the needle. Like if they had Boise State in later in November and they hadn't played this year and they beat Boise in theory, that may get them in consideration. I just don't think even at 11-1, they have much of a chance at this point. I think it's pretty slim. They're going to be able to play their way in.
I want to talk Big 12 just a second, but Army at North Texas, huge game this weekend for the G5 spot. Boise State has all but Nevada at Boise State this weekend. You got Temple at Tulane's, another one to keep an eye on. Is there any other playoff G5 implications than those? I think those are the three big ones, of course. And here's the other question I had. Is it possible for Boise State to get to the 4 seed?
Yes, I think it is. They're going to need some Big 12 chaos, obviously. But as we saw last weekend, and I think as the schedule tells us, we're going to get some more of that. So I think there is a good chance of that. The other possibility here is that Boise State is not the 12 seed. I think it's been very easy to pencil them in as 12 every time you do the rankings. They could be 10, they could be 11. So I wouldn't be surprised. I also think when you look at Boise State's schedule the rest of the way, it's pretty easy. Nevada at San Jose State, Wyoming, and then Oregon State. However, they need UNLV to get to the conference championship game. And right now, Colorado State has boxed out UNLV. Yep. Colorado State still has to go to Fresno. We'll see what happens there. But that may help Boise if they get a rematch over a pretty good UNLV team. But I would say all those scenarios are on the table. I would not assume that Boise State is 12th. I would not assume that they are just going to be the 5th conference champion. I think they got a good shot to be the 4th one and have an off week.
It's very Cincinnati of them. Yeah. All right. So the other big winner and look, they benefited a lot too. Washington State being good, Oregon being number 1, like they're benefiting as well, and will continue to roll. That Army North Texas game, that's sneaky good, man.
It is a significant contrast in styles because, as you know, Army, of course, loves to run the ball, but North Texas is second in the country in passing offense. Chandler Morris has been outstanding for the Mean Green. And don't forget, Bryson Daly did not play last week for Army. So to your point, big matchup because looking ahead, I think Tulane is kind of rounding into form. I still think Tulane's the best team in the American.
I agree.
Memphis lost to UTSA. So if Army gets past this game, they get Notre Dame and UTSA. The odds that we're going to get Army and Tulane in the American Athletic Conference Championship game seem pretty high to me.
I know we have sort of a clear, like BYU's undefeated in the Big 12, and I want to get to the Big 12 here, but we have 2 teams that are undefeated in the Big 10. We have SMU after dominating Pittsburgh, and of course Miami still, although they also played with their food against Duke for the better
first
part
half,
of 3 quarters. And then they just sort of did the Cam Ward thing in the 4th quarter. It sort of feels like there's kind of some clarity in the Big Ten championship game, but then again, Indiana's going to play Ohio State, and there you could create a 3-way tie there for second place. Right now, BYU's in the driver's seat to get a spot in the Big 12 championship game, but there's a lot left to be decided with tiebreakers and games for all 3 of the other teams: Iowa State, Colorado, and Kansas State. And the SEC is completely up in the air. My question is, do you think we have more chaos heading into conference championship games at this stage of the season than we've had in the past?
Yes, because there's no divisions, because it's a free-for-all. And you look at the tiebreakers, it gets very confusing if you don't have a head-to-head matchup, but it's the no divisions plus the unbalanced schedules. Everybody's missing. This is one of the big things we talked about with Missouri this preseason was favorable schedule. If they could get to 11-1, they got a good chance to play for the SEC championship game. So yes, it feels like we know who the front runners are, but it also feels like there is more chaos or uncertainty still to come or that we're still trying to figure out, largely because we don't have divisions this year.
Yeah, it's important to note it's not because of playoff expansion or the committee or certainly the balance and the parity is because of roster rules and management and those kinds of things. But no, it's exclusively about expansion of the conferences and no divisions that is allowing all this weirdness to happen. All right, so if the 10-2 at-large bid was the biggest winner, and maybe SMU, frankly, because of Clemson's loss, the biggest winner in in the country last week. Very quickly behind that is Colorado and the Big 12. So Iowa State loses. Look, they did sort of the exact Iowa State thing, Stephen. Which I don't think you and I have talked about this for years. You cannot live the entire season on one score, come from behind, last possession wins, and expect to keep doing it. They did it against Texas Tech and then just couldn't hold up on the final drive. Give credit to Brooks and those guys for Texas Tech that they fought all the way through bad weather and got that win in the final possession there, or what was basically the final possession. Iowa State will now play at Kansas, Cincinnati, at Utah, and Kansas State. All winnable games, and a handful of those that they could win or they could lose. BYU, of course, was off last week. They will play at Utah in the Holy War this weekend. This weekend. And then Kansas at Arizona State, which is tricky. And Houston, by the way, watch out for Houston. They have 3 times as many wins as Oklahoma State and Arizona combined in the Big 12. Colorado, of course, who has lost to Kansas State, and so Kansas State has the tiebreaker over Colorado, will get Texas Tech, Utah, Kansas, and Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State, by the way, dead last without a win in the
Mike
conference.
Gundy also closing strong on the recruiting trail to get some extra NIL dollars by his comments this week too. So,
did his son go and vote for him though?
I don't know.
Anyway, Kansas State, of course, their losses are now to BYU in the tiebreaker in Houston, and will play Arizona State, Cincinnati, and Iowa State. Is it as simple as the winner of the Iowa State-Kansas State's probably going to play BYU in the Big 12 championship game, or where are you at on this?
Well, I think
Farmageddon for the playoff.
I mean, I thought Kansas State had a pretty, I was kind of banking on this Kansas State team being the best team in the Big 12, and then of course they kind of gave away the game against Houston. So yeah, Farmageddon feels like it's going to decide a spot, but also I think that Kansas is probably the team that's going to play the biggest X factor in this, because like you said, they get Iowa State, BYU, and Colorado
in back-to-back weeks, the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, they're due. They're due to beat somebody in this stretch. And in fact, it wouldn't surprise me if they get 2 of these teams, they get them all, they get none of them. Like, they're due. And in fact, that might be one of my picks against the spread this week. But
you're going against the Clones, Cyclones. All right, okay.
Their Jayhawks are due.
Okay, all right. Okay.
But your point, I think, still stands. And I would be BYU continues to sort of defy the Vegas odds, the metrics every week. They keep getting better. They find ways to win close games. It does feel like at some point the chaos of the Big 12 will catch up to them too. Perhaps this week in the Holy War. I know Utah is struggling, but Kyle Whittingham does well in this series.
And that would be the chaos of thousands of years of
Very good. Yes. Also, that at Arizona State, I think, will be tricky. And Houston, under Willie Fritz, is getting better every week. I mean, they seem to be peaking at the end of the season. So none of these schedules, I think, there's none of them that I would just say they're going to run the table. And I feel like we're going to be due for chaos a couple times before this is all said and done. But if you're Colorado, I think you probably feel pretty good about where you are based upon what happened last weekend.
No, very good. But I still don't see Colorado winning all 4 of these games either.
I don't think
I mean, they get 3 at home. Yeah. They get 3 at home, but at Texas Tech, we just learned that's a sneaky tough team. Texas Tech has played good football after like the first week of the season. They've had a couple of weird moments in there, hiccups, but like I don't know, like if they lose one, then all of a sudden Kansas State has the tiebreaker. So it's going to be wild. I just can't see any of these 4 teams finishing perfectly the rest of the way. I think almost all of them are going to lose a game.
I mean, Colorado could lose at Texas Tech this weekend, to your point, or at Kansas. Utah is hard to figure out because they have not been very good this year, but they're still playing good defense. And if the off week gave them a chance to reset offensively, there's a couple obviously big time matchups for them. But it still feels like every team is probably going to lose in the month of November, which, we're probably going to come down to your point to Farmageddon at the end of the season for at least one spot.
What's fascinating is Utah will also play those exact same three teams over the course of the next 3 weeks. They will play BYU this weekend, Colorado the following, and then Iowa State after that. They'll get 2 of those games at home. And what's interesting is, and this is sort of a formula for late season upsets. If you just, I haven't studied this, but it kind of just hit me, so I might do some digging on this over the next week. But teams that have preseason expectations and then things don't necessarily go their way. I mean, Utah and Kansas were 2 of the top 4 or 5 teams in the conference this year in the preseason rankings, which means they had the makings of a good potential and a good football team. I don't think that those are 2 good coaches and 2 teams that kind of know how to find answers to problems. Those are 2 teams. Those are the types of teams you do not want to play late in the year, because while they don't have seasons that are anything special for them, they absolutely are good enough to beat people and knock some folks off. So I'm willing to bet you that Kansas gets 1 and Utah gets 1. And at the end of this whole thing, we're going to be looking at a BYU Kansas State rematch.
I would sign up for that. I think the first game was pretty one-sided. I think it'd be a little bit different this time around. I will say on Utah, some of their offensive woes, I don't know if they're going to be able to solve them this year. I'm just going to be blunt with you. Promoting Mike Bajakian is not going to get it done. I don't care if it was working out with Andy Ludwig, but Mike Bajakian ain't it. It's not going to improve the offense that much. They're 119th in the country in offensive success rate. And of course, they've now cycled through a couple of different quarterbacks. So if Utah is going to be a factor here, and I trust Kyle Whittingham, but that offense is pretty bad, they're really going to have to lean on that defense, which isn't impossible. Like I said, I think they could beat BYU. I mean, you look at the odds this weekend, BYU is only like a field goal favorite in Salt Lake City.
No, the 2 big ones in the SEC are like the center stage of this weekend. But those 3 Big 12 games, I guarantee you someone's going to lose. It's Iowa State at Kansas, Colorado at Texas Tech, and BYU at Utah. All 3 of those teams that are supposed to be favored to play and compete at least over the final month for a Big 12 championship spot, all 3 on the road against all 3 teams that could beat you. One of them is going to lose. And honestly, those 3 is like where it's interesting to me. Outside of those 2 big SEC games this weekend, there's a lot of good stuff. Like, don't get me wrong, Clemson at Virginia Tech is interesting, and Michigan and Indiana is a really fascinating sort of dichotomy of like trajectories. But those Big 12 teams, those 3 on top of the Big 12, that is utterly fascinating. And oh, by the way, Kansas State's they're not hosting Arizona State this weekend. That's next weekend. So Kansas State's off. So the 3 big challengers, or the 3 big teams atop the standings, it's very possible that one of them loses, if not more than one, this weekend. So this is the Big 12 we were all rooting for, Stephen.
I think I saw a stat, and I apologize if this is wrong, but I think somebody said that there were like 14 teams still technically alive to play for the Big 12 championship game, 14 out of 16. So,
and Oklahoma State's not one of them.
I know. Yeah, Oklahoma State and Arizona are a combined 1-11 in conference play. So what a weird year. But like we talked about, this is what happens when you don't get much separation between these teams.
Do you remember when I asked you, like, who in the top 15 is just not going to be there in the preseason? And you were like, well, they're all going to be there. And it's like, no, that's not how this works.
I don't think I remember that. I seem to remember.
Arizona and Oklahoma State, 2 preseason top 25 teams.
I told
1-11 in conference.
I told you I had major concerns about Arizona. Now, I did not expect the bottom to fall out at Oklahoma State or Utah. So,
yeah, I hear you. Okay. All right. Let's see what else we got. Let's talk Pittsburgh and SMU, which ties directly into BYU, because BYU's resume just keeps getting better with SMU continuing to win. Who would have thunk it? We were watching a playoff preview with SMU and BYU. What was that, like week 2, week 3?
It was not a particularly well played game either.
Yeah.
So,
and again, with a list of teams that aren't going to always cross over and play each other with no divisions, SMU totally dominated against Pittsburgh, which was a really nice showing for SMU. I mean, we're talking Coach of the Year stuff with SMU, not just in the ACC but nationally. They are off this weekend. Clemson, of course, has to rebound after getting largely dominated by Louisville, at Virginia Tech. Miami is at Georgia Tech this weekend. Pittsburgh has Virginia at home. They've got a chance there. And then if you want to slide in the Notre Dame hosting Florida State in a game that was supposed to matter and now is not even really close. But Notre Dame is a team that if you focus on the playoff, you can kind of forget about a little bit. What do you make of the ACC race now? Because SMU has a very real chance to be undefeated at the end of the year in the conference and will not have played any of the other teams fighting for spots, which we talked about. But it's definitely more of a factor now. So,
well, I think the first thing that jumps out to me is just how impressive this offense has been since they made the switch at quarterback to Kevin Jennings. He threw for over 300 yards last week against Pitt. Their offense has just been, I mean, I don't want to say unstoppable, but it's looked very good since they made the switch. I think in terms of the ACC race, I thought Clemson had kind of turned a corner offensively, and you just look at how that game played out against Louisville. Like, I think Cade Klubnik had about 4 yards per attempt. Their defense struggled to stop the run. Not surprised that Louisville had some success offensively, but I think for a team that had been rolling for the most part since the Georgia loss, that was a pretty surprising showing. And you look at their schedule, they still have to go, like you said, to Virginia Tech. Does Kyron Drones play this week is kind of a looming question in all this, but go to Pitt. SMU's schedule is pretty favorable. I tend to believe that all these teams are going to lose one more time, but BC at Virginia, maybe it's the Calgorithm in the last week of the season. Traditional ACC rivals, SMU, California get together. So
if SMU loses one and they're tied, do you have the tiebreaker scenario right now? Do you know what it would be between Clemson and, assuming Miami runs the table and gets in?
Well, Miami probably should be sweating because Georgia Tech, we know what happened last year.
That's true.
Mario Cristobal probably breaking out in cold sweats thinking about that.
Just calling James Franklin to see how he should manage the end of the game.
Yes. So, by the way, Haynes King, not sure if he's going to be able to go for Georgia Tech. No,
they do not have much of a passing offense when he's not in the game, and they don't have a huge passing offense when he's in the game.
He can make some plays at least, though. I mean, Georgia. If Haynes,
I didn't say they didn't have an offense or that he wasn't good. I said I was joking about him maybe being okay at passing and not great.
Well, right. I think if he is healthy, though, Miami's defense is very vulnerable to the pass.
Yes,
so it would not surprise me if Georgia Tech, if he's out there, can keep this one a little bit closer. I think it's a double-digit spread.
Somebody's going to get Miami, aren't they? Miami's been trying to lose the whole time.
Well, their schedule's pretty favorable the rest of the way.
You know how much talent you have to recruit to try to lose games and still be undefeated?
Well, at Georgia Tech, Wake Forest,
gross.
At Syracuse, old Big East, rivals getting together up in the Dome last week of the season.
6-2 Syracuse.
Good bounce back win for the Qs over Virginia Tech.
They will visit Boston College this weekend, so keep an eye on that. That's a sneaky, interesting game there for the Qs.
Yeah. By the way, so Syracuse plays at Boston College this week, and then they go to California next week to play the Golden Bears. Talking about the crisscross of the country in the ACC.
California at Wake Forest. It still should be played in the second week of the season in non-conference play. It's very strange.
Yes.
Eventually we'll get over this thing and not talk about it like this, but maybe not. Who knows? So we're basically looking at an SMU. Although, have you gotten to the tiebreakers yet?
I was not able to locate them here in time. It gets a little confusing once you get.
Don't you want to see Clemson instead of SMU, or do you want to see SMU Miami? You know what? SMU Miami could be spectacular football. Well, just from like a chaos standpoint, it could be a really great game.
Yeah. Well, also there's storylines. Brett Lashley, of course, is a former Miami offensive coordinator. There's some ex-Miami players on the SMU roster as transfers. You also have the firepower of the two quarterbacks, Jennings and Cam Ward. I think it'd be a heck of a game. Honestly, like I said,
first one to 50.
Yeah, they're not a whole lot of defensive stops in that game. I really thought Clemson had turned a corner, but
I know. What happened there with Louisville?
They could not stop the run. They also had a couple field goals blocked. Just kind of a poor showing. And this is, by the way, this is not a Louisville defense that was looking like the strength of the ACC coming into that game. So for an offense that looked like it had turned a corner, they did not play well, and the defense surprisingly let Clemson down as well.
All right. We looked at all these different conferences. Any of these lower tier games that you're side eyeing? We're going to get to the big ones in the SEC, but did you Duke, NC State's interesting. We'd already mentioned Cuse and Boston College. West Virginia, Cincinnati, the old Big East rivalry is an interesting one to keep an eye on. UCF coming off a very impressive performance against Arizona. They'll play Arizona State. That's interesting. I'm definitely keeping an eye on Minnesota. Just like I see what you're doing over there. Let's see what you do. Let's go on the road and beat Rutgers this weekend, and then we can maybe talk. Iowa, very impressive against Wisconsin last weekend. They'll play at UCLA. So yeah, I don't know. Just some interesting teams. Any other games in the Big 10, Big 12, ACC that you're like, I think those are interesting.
Well, I think Iowa at UCLA is interesting, largely because I just wanted to mention UCLA beating Nebraska last week. It was a really nice win for UCLA.
Yeah.
Not great for Nebraska. I think we can kind of see where this is going because Dana Holgerson is now an offensive consultant with Nebraska. Shocking that Marcus Satterfield didn't work out after being terrible at South Carolina. But anyways,
You've been down on Satterfield for a long time.
He's awful. I'll just
I got you.
In all seriousness, yeah, good win by UCLA last week. Nebraska's off, so I'll be curious to see if they get better offensively over the off week, but also USC, who they're going to play in 2 weeks, change quarterbacks. It'll be Jaden Maivia, the UNLV transfer, instead of Miller Moss. But I think you kind of covered the bulk of those games. This is a very top-heavy weekend with the SEC, but a lot of these mid-tier games like UCF at Arizona State, Florida State, Notre Dame, West Virginia, Cincy, kind of important as like second-tier games, whether it's for bowl positioning or like Neil Brown coaches on the hot seat type stuff.
Well, all 4 Big Ten teams are at home and largely favored pretty heavily in all of their games. Oregon heavy favored over Maryland at home. Ohio State heavy favored over Purdue at home. Penn State not as heavy a favorite over Washington. Interesting point spread there, but I think that'll be one to keep an eye on there. And then of course Indiana, just from like a brand standpoint, is interesting to keep an eye on. And also here's the other one: Dave Aranda getting a contract extension at Baylor. Like, what is going on?
I think his seat has gone from scorching hot to cooling very fast. So they close at West Virginia, at Houston, and then Kansas. I think if they can find one more in there, I think he's probably safe. There is a little bit of a thought experiment that I wanted to mention real quick because now you brought up the hot seat thing, and I got to thinking, what if this year's coaching carousel is just kind of quiet, and then next year it's Lincoln Riley, Mike Norvell, Brent Venables, Hugh Freeze. It feels like this year might be trending to a slower hot seat, but next year could be pretty volatile, and a lot of big time names might be moving around. So
I hear that. All right, let's talk Georgia Ole Miss. I think Georgia is one of the only teams in the country that could go 10-2 in the regular season, make it to the conference championship game, lose, and still get in.
I agree.
And that would include a win over Ole Miss on the road. Ole Miss is a team that, despite the losses early, could beat Georgia this weekend and get in as an at-large team. So, in theory, Ole Miss could win this game and put both teams into the playoff. In theory, but then again, I don't know if Georgia even gets into the conference championship game with 2 losses. So, is there a 2-loss team in the SEC championship game?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's a good chance, right? I mean, Tennessee. I mean, I'd say Tennessee's an underdog to Georgia. Texas and Texas A&M are going to play. I guess if A&M beats Texas, they're probably who knows?
Bama beats LSU. That's 2 losses for LSU.
Yeah.
A&M beats Texas. That's 2 losses for both of them. Georgia loses to Ole Miss. That's 2 losses for Georgia. 2 losses for Ole Miss. But then beats Tennessee. Then you have 2 more losses. You have another 2-loss team in Tennessee. The Bama LSU game is far more. To me, it's more interesting from a schematic sort of like X's and O's standpoint because I still don't know how good either of them are. I think they're both like Penn State. I think they're very good. They're just flawed. Whereas with Georgia and Ole Miss, I kind of feel like I know what they both are. And I don't know how to explain Georgia's problems, Carson Beck's problems. It's easy to explain Ole Miss to me. I just feel like Ole Miss is easily understood. Does that make sense?
I think Georgia's problems aren't necessarily, they have flaws. Obviously, Carson Beck continues to throw interceptions. That's a problem. I also think there's a switch that Georgia can find, and we saw this against Texas. their A game beats everybody in college football. I don't want to say maybe attention span tends to wander a little bit in some of these games, like the Mississippi State game. I think the turnovers played a large role in Florida leading in the first half of that game. But I still think if I had to make a pick, like they would be the team that I think wins it all just because I sort of just trust them to turn it on at the right point. I think what's interesting about the Ole Miss game, and I think we'll find out, we saw Georgia's front just absolutely annihilate Texas a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
If Ole Miss can't block Kentucky,
Yep.
and they have trouble with other teams so far this year, they're not going to block Georgia unless there's something that we're not seeing or Lane Kiffin's got working here. So that to me, as much as we're going to focus about the quarterbacks and receivers, and we'll see if Trey Harris is back, but to me, this is a line of scrimmage game, and Ole Miss, I think, defensively matches up. Offensively, they're going to have their best game of the year to win this one.
And I agree, and I think both these two games are about pressure. And if Carson Beck is under pressure, which he could be, because Ole Miss's defensive front has been so good, that's where he gets into trouble. That's where he throws his interceptions, where it looks like he's just like brain dead for a momentary like blackout or something. It's very strange. And then same thing with Jackson Dart, to your point. I also think the same thing can be said for like Garrett Nussmeier is really, really good as long as he's not facing a bunch of pressure. He's been good against the blitz, but he was terrible against the blitz in the second half against A&M. And then Alabama with time off, like I don't know what they are from week to week other than being a really, really good team. Jalen Milroe, what is the plan that Kalen DeBoer has to put Milroe into spots to find success on the road against an improving but still flawed LSU defense? I think Alabama and Georgia are better football teams, and I think they should go and win these two games on the road. That's my thinking. I wouldn't be surprised at anything, though, honestly. For the first time ever, I wouldn't be surprised if Ole Miss actually won a game like this.
Yeah, I think if you're Lane Kiffin, I think you need to get this one because obviously your playoff hopes are on the line, but all the kind of theme of the season for Ole Miss was, hey, this is the last dance. We've got all these guys together. We went very heavy into the portal, and if you lose this game, you're not getting in. It's kind of disappointing. To your point on Alabama, LSU, Alabama has 18 sacks this year, and I know sacks aren't necessarily indicative of pressure and all that, but LSU being at home, they are down an offensive line starter on Saturday night, but I think LSU being at home is a huge check in their favor. They had so much trouble defending Marcel Reed 2 weeks ago. They've had 2 weeks to figure this out. Jalen Miller ran all over him last year, 155 yards and 4 touchdowns. So they better have an answer, and I'm guessing they will. I think whichever offensive line protects for the two quarterbacks, I think both offenses are going to have a lot of success because these secondaries for both teams, I think, are vulnerable. So it wouldn't surprise me. I think like the over-under is like 58 or so. It wouldn't surprise me if we see some points in this one on Saturday night. So
Brian Kelly's comments after the game against A&M, like, oh, well, I'd run the ball against us too. It's like, well, I hope you figured something out, to your point. So
you've had 2 weeks to get ready. You better have a better plan this time.
Yeah. Florida and Texas. How about Florida? Let me ask you this about Florida. Would anybody have a better record against their schedule than Florida has?
That's a good question.
Their losses are 2. Undefeated Miami. Texas A&M, I guess, just took a hit, so maybe that loss is not as good. They almost and probably should have won the game against Tennessee, and now they've lost to basically number 2 Georgia.
I think they've held up about as well as they could given the schedule, I guess.
On their third quarterback, literally getting JV play in the second half of that game.
That's what I was going to say. The quarterback thing is pretty problematic moving forward. I guess to me, there's a question here about if you're looking at the schedule, you're asking kind of about Napier and kind of his future. Is like, I think a check in his favor is Florida keeps fighting despite injuries. And it's not just quarterbacks. They've been missing Eugene Wilson. They've been missing Jason Marshall. They've had some injuries, but they keep fighting. They almost won at Tennessee. Now, the other side of it is they got absolutely massacred by Miami and Texas A&M at home, and that was pretty embarrassing. Yeah. You can point to improvement on defense, and that is fine. I will also tell you, UCF was not playing well offensively, neither has Tennessee, and Kentucky's bad. Georgia tried to give them the ball several times. So I'm a little skeptical about the defensive improvement, but I think I give Napier some credit for fighting and finding ways to keep this team competitive. unless Lagway comes back, I don't see them beating Texas or LSU or Ole Miss or even Florida State at this point, though.
I think, I mean, Lagway needs to come back, but I could see them winning a couple of up. They could win. They might be able to get to a bowl game if he's back, but we'll see about that.
Here's something to keep in mind, too.
Okay.
If you're Florida and you're trying to get to a bowl game, let's say Lagway comes back, I think they could beat Florida State with Lagway. But what about Ole Miss if they lose to Georgia? They get nothing to play. They could pick them off easily.
Absolutely, they could upset one of those two, Ole Miss or LSU, at home.
Yeah,
because they get them at home if the quarterback's healthy. I agree. South Carolina, Vanderbilt, all of a sudden, sneaky, awesome football game.
Yeah.
Talk about like line of scrimmage, trench warfare. That's right, versus between South Carolina and Vanderbilt, which is insane. Here's a theory I want to float to you about Tennessee, by the way. Okay win against Kentucky. Nothing special, but solid. Got to keep winning. And then they play Mississippi State as like a 3.5 touchdown favorite this weekend. I was describing them as Georgia light to some folks this week when I was asked, because they play conservatively to the strength of their defense on offense in the first half. Their quarterback is inconsistent but very talented and tall and slender. Nico and Carson Beck, just long necks. And the defense is among the best, most talented, and dominant in the entire country from start to finish of the season. They are among the best. And then they sort of just wait and kind of like test waters and play conservatively. And then in the second half, the quarterback maybe finds a play or two. They lean on a running game that eventually overpowers its opponents in the fourth quarter. Doesn't it feel like Tennessee is sort of like a miniature poor man's version of Georgia? I mean, almost. I mean, if they had equal talent, you might say the same thing as Georgia.
That's actually an interesting comparison that I hadn't thought about this year, but there is some truth in that. It's kind of, I think, one of the under the radar things about this Tennessee team, and there are two things actually. I think Dylan Sampson very quietly is having an All-America caliber season, and no one seems to be talking about it. He's been awesome for Tennessee all year. Also, I thought Nico, to go back to the other thing, Tennessee's defense has been really good all year too. And I think that's kind of the thing we didn't know about Heupel when he came to Tennessee was, could he build a defense that could compete in the SEC?
Yep.
Their defensive front's good. Now, I don't know about their secondary when they play good quarterbacks. I think it's kind of vulnerable, but if you can protect their plays.
But it's not needed like half the season to get better. It came out of the box ready to go in week one and has been dominant every step of the way.
100%. And the other thing is Nico, I thought may have had one of his better games of the season against Kentucky. I mean,
it's starting to you can start to see the pieces fall into place. Yeah.
And some of the, we look at accuracy and completion rate and all that stuff, but I mean, when he puts the ball in the spot and the guy drops it, or, he just maybe misfires, he's missing sometimes long, which tells me like you can just dial it back a little bit. So
Joe Milton disagrees.
I think he's a better quarterback than Joe Milton.
No, totally. He's missed a lot of throws like Joe Milton this year, though. And that being said, the last 2 weeks, they have been a little bit more accurate. One of them was a tough catch this past weekend, but the receiver dove and probably should have caught it, but like it was a tough catch. So I don't know. It's just one of those where like they kind of feel like Georgia, which is they're conservative in the first half on purpose, which probably is maddening for a lot of folks that watch them, and because they know the defense is going to keep them in the game no matter what. And it did it against Arkansas, did it against Florida, did it against Oklahoma, did it against Alabama, and did it against Kentucky. They're just like, we're just going to test and poke and prod and kind of see what works. And then by the third quarter, we're going to give it to Dylan Sampson.
Although they have had some turnover issues, missed field goals, especially on Saturday against Kentucky. Like there are some small things they could do better offensively to help them. The other kind of striking thing about this is Tennessee has not scored more than 28 points in an SEC game this year. That's pretty surprising to me, just from track record of Heupel and some of the pieces that they had coming into this year.
Especially considering their points per game average last year in the SEC, which was also very, very low for a Josh Heupel offense. Picks against the spread. Here's the thing about this weekend. There's only 2 major games. Because, by the way, Indiana being a 14-point favorite over Michigan while Georgia's only a 2-point favorite over Ole Miss is mind-boggling. I don't understand the world we live in. But there are so many small point spreads in good games this weekend that I think we're going to get. I think every week from here on out is going to be chaos every Saturday. I think it's going to be awesome. I can't wait.
I agree.
And I'm not picking any games because I went 1-1 last week. So I'm not going to announce. I'm not going to announce.
Well,
I had Michigan State plus 7.5. That was stupid.
Let me tell you about this weekend's spread picks.
Okay.
We went 2-1.
Uh-oh.
However,
Are you at 500?
at 500, however, I had the champagne ready. South Alabama was cruising. And then they proceeded to have a fourth quarter meltdown, which cost me a perfect 3-0 week.
Yeah.
So
what are you, 21 and 21?
21 and 21.
Attaboy.
We're no longer in Trent Dilfer territory. We are just Sam Pittman, the spread picks.
All right, then you're the only one that gets to pick games because you have a not losing record.
All right. Well, speaking of Trent Dilfer, let's start there. The UConn Huskies are a 6-point favorite against UAB. I like the UConn Huskies to cover. UConn Huskies also bowl eligible. Good win last week over Georgia State to get that 6th victory. So I like UConn -6. I am also, I sort of teased this earlier. I like Kansas 3.5 against Iowa State.
Okay.
Even if they don't win, I think the Jayhawks can get a cover. Let's stay in the Big 12. I'm going to take Utah +4.
Okay. All right.
Just something. I can tell you, I don't feel great about it, but this is one of those ones I'm just going to bank on Kyle Whittingham and some defense and the home crowd of Salt Lake City. The other one,
fair.
Let me give you the other one here. LSU +3 against Alabama. I like LSU to cover that.
Ooh,
I actually subbed out Virginia Tech and Clemson. Virginia Tech is a 6.5-point underdog against Clemson. I was going to take Virginia Tech, and then I read Brent Pry's quotes about how he doesn't, he's kind of uncertain whether Kyron Jones or Tutton's going to play. So I quickly moved that off the board and subbed in Utah. So what do you think of those?
I like all of them. I think what you do is you cast a wide net on the Big 12 and you take all 3 underdogs and you might win 2. Or you might win all 3 against the spread and then 1 outright. But again, I'm kind of going through here and looking at the Power 4 games that I've written down and just looking at the point spreads across the board. And the number of games that are a touchdown or less in these conferences is like Clemson, Pittsburgh, NC State, Duke, Syracuse, Iowa State, Colorado, Utah, Georgia, LSU, Bama, Vandy, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Missouri's only a 3-point spread. Minnesota's less than there are a ton of games a touchdown or less. I like your picks. I like the UConn pick. I'm glad you got off. I would not go anything with Clemson right now. I don't know where they're at mentally. They're like Ole Miss. Like they're teetering. They could absolutely rally, win out. SMU loses. They get into the ACC championship game. Wouldn't be surprised, though, if all those players are like, man, we've been hearing a lot of noise for the last 3 years, and we are done with it. So who knows?
What about your surging Minnesota Golden Gophers?
-6?
Yeah, that's
I like that.
interesting.
I like that one. I told you, I'm side-eyeing all of the Gophers on the course.
Minnesota curious, Minnesota nice.
Yeah. You want me to kill all the Gophers on the course? Okay. Well, I think it's going to be a great weekend. I think the Big 12 is wide open. I think there's 2 huge games in the SEC. We've got Big 10 challengers trying to hold serve. You got ACC teams, maybe Clemson, Miami on the road. It's going to be a really interesting week. I can't wait to discuss all the rankings next week on the show. We'll do that. You can watch us, of course, on YouTube as well. Steven, where can the good folks find you?
You can check out all my work at athlonsports.com, at athlonsteven on Twitter, StevenLCFB over on Facebook and Instagram.
There you have it. Thank you for listening, everybody. Rate, review, and subscribe. Please, please, please tell somebody about the show. If you do not give us 5 stars, you are a hater. For Steven, I am Braden. Thank you for listening. Enjoy a wild week of college football coming up. Week 11, folks. Enjoy it. There's not many of them left. We will be back next week to talk all about it right here on the Athlon Sports Cover 2 podcast.